we're going to talk about the neurochemistry of drive and mindset. So all these themes are woven together in the context of emotions. Now, let's just talk about the neuroscience of motivation and reward, of pleasure and pain, because those are central to what we think of as emotions, whether or not we feel good, whether or not we feel we're on track in life, whether or not we feel we're falling behind. So motivation is fundamental to our daily life. It's what allows us to get out of bed in the morning. It's what allows us to pursue long-term goals or short-term goals. Motivation and the chemistry of motivation is tightly wound in with the neurochemistry of movement. In fact, the same single molecule, dopamine, is responsible for our sense of motivation and for movement. Even though nerves controlling muscles, so again, these are nerves in the spinal cord or brain that move our limbs, the effector chemical there, the one that actually causes the muscles to twitch, to contract, is acetylcholine. In the brain, acetylcholine is responsible for focus. There's a fundamental relationship between dopamine released in your brain and your desire to exert effort. And you can actually control the schedule of dopamine release, but it requires the appropriate knowledge. This is one of those cases where understanding the way the dopamine system works will allow you to leverage it to your benefit. And if you don't understand the way that dopamine works, there's a good chance that it's going to pull you out into the current of life, meaning the rest of the world is going to control your dopamine schedules. Feature of motivation, which is that motivation is a two-part process, which is about balancing pleasure and pain. Okay? Most people think about motivation and reward and dopamine as just trying to achieve pleasure. And indeed, dopamine is released in the brain from the VTA at the nucleus accumbens when we experience things that we like. So here's the way to conceptualize this. And if you can internalize this in your mind, it will really help you as you move through your day, trying to understand why you might be motivated or not motivated for certain things. So when you're just sitting around, not doing much of anything, maybe you wake up in bed in the morning, you're thinking about getting up or not, this reward pathway is releasing dopamine at a rate of about 3 or 4 times. Dopamine is responsible for wanting and for craving. And that's distinctly different from the way that you hear it talked about normally, which is that it's involved in pleasure. So yes, dopamine is released in response to sex. It's released in response to food. It's released in response to a lot of things, but it's mostly released in anticipation and craving for a particular thing. It has the effect of narrowing our focus for the thing that we crave. And that thing could be as simple as a cup of coffee. It could be as important as a big board meeting. It could be a big final exam. It could be the person that we're excited to meet or see. Dopamine doesn't care about what your important feature of motivation, which is that motivation is a two-part process, which is about balancing pleasure and pain. Enough is never enough. The only thing that dopamine really wants is more of the thing that releases dopamine. And so big inflections in dopamine, whether or not they come from cocaine or whether or not they come from a supplementation, caffeine, exercise, study regime, will just make you want more of something. And examples of subjective effects over things that would otherwise seem hardwired, because they really illustrate the interplay between our cognition, our belief system, and what would otherwise be these, just plug and chug kind of mechanisms of, you eat X amount of chocolate or you drink X amount of water after being water deprived for a certain amount of time and you get X amount of dopamine. Here's the experiment. The experiment was just published on March 18th, 2021, so very recently. And the title of the experiment is Expectation for Stimulant Type Modifies Caffeine's Effects on Mood and Cognition. This was done in college students. It's a fascinating study. What they did is they gave college students either placebo, essentially nothing, or 200 milligrams of caffeine. 200 milligrams of caffeine is about what's in, a typical coffee, like a medium coffee that you would buy, a drip coffee, or a coffee that you'd make at home. It's a fair amount of caffeine. If you were to take it in pill form, it would definitely make you feel more alert, unless you were one of those mutants, literally mutants, that is insensitive to caffeine. And those mutants are pretty rare. So they took 65 undergraduate students in college. They randomized them to either placebo or caffeine, and they told them that they were either getting caffeine or Adderall. Now, Adderall cognitively carries a very different expectation. College students know Adderall to be a much stronger stimulant than caffeine. They know it to create a sort of high. This is the way the students described it. And they thought that it would increase their level of focus and their ability to perform work. So what was really interesting is there was definitely an effect of placebo versus caffeine. That's not surprising, however, right? You take a placebo, you may or may not feel more alert. But you take 200 milligrams of caffeine, very likely you're going to feel very alert. But there was also an effect of whether or not the students thought they were getting caffeine or Adderall. The subjects receiving caffeine reported feeling more stimulated, anxious, and motivated than the subjects that received the placebo. Okay. But the ones that expected Adderall reported stronger amphetamine effects. So they felt much more high. They performed better on a working memory test. And in general, they had all the increased cognitive effects that would have been seen with Adderall, but they were only ingesting caffeine. And so this shows an interaction between the drug, caffeine, and the expectation that it was Adderall. So it led to heightened performance simply because the students thought they were getting Adderall. Now, I don't know whether or not they told them at the end that it wasn't Adderall. I doubt that they did. This, if you want to look it up, this study was published in the Journal of Experimental Clinical Psychopharmacology. The paper is Looby et al., Looby et al. And again, it was just published March 18th, 2021. Speaks to the fact that, yes, there are so-called placebo effects, but this is different than placebo. This is a belief effect about what the specific reactions to a given stimulant ought to be. And I think this is very important because I think that it points to the fact that the top down, the kind of higher level cognitive processes are impacting even the most basic fundamental aspects of, say, dopamine release or our adrenaline release or epinephrine release in ways that can positively impact performance. In this case, it was a positive improvement in working memory and focus. As long as we're talking about caffeine, I'd like to point out a study that's really interesting. This was published in Journal of Neuroscience, which is the Society for Neuroscience's kind of flagship journal. It's their journal. It's a good journal. And what they showed was that caffeine can increase dopamine release in the brain by about 30%. That wasn't surprising. I even said that earlier. But what they also showed is that it has a protective effect on dopamine neurons. So caffeine in some cases may not just increase dopamine release, but it might actually have a protective effect on dopamine neurons. Now, that's distinctly different from some claims that drugs like MDMA, ecstasy, it's been argued are neurotoxic for things like dopamine and serotonin neurons. The study that was published about that in the journal Science, which is an extremely prestigious, excellent journal, later it was shown that it wasn't MDMA, ecstasy, that was given in that case. It was actually amphetamine, which is known to destroy dopaminergic and serotonergic neurons. So what does this mean? This means that low levels of caffeine may, at least in a few studies, be protective for dopamine neurons over time. That MDMA, ecstasy, something that's in clinical trials right now for the treatment of trauma, PTSD of various kinds, and depression, but still illegal at this point in time, may, although it doesn't appear yet from any published studies, destroy dopaminergic neurons, perhaps serotonergic neurons. So there's a real asterisk and a question mark there. But amphetamine, and in particular methamphetamine, is very destructive for dopaminergic neurons. So I don't think any of us needed any additional reasons to avoid methamphetamine, this drug that creates huge increases in dopamine and then huge crashes from that dopamine. Very destructive drug, but in addition to that, seems to destroy dopaminergic neurons. From time to time, I've talked about nicotine on here, not smoking, because obviously smoking is bad, lung cancer is bad for health, etc. But nicotine, it's in supplemental form. I've mentioned that a very famous neuroscientist, Nobel Prize-winning scientist, chews a lot of Nicorette. I know other people who chew Nicorette. They believe in its neuroprotective effects for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And indeed, nicotine can stimulate dopamine release. We talked about that earlier. Whether or not it has a protective effect isn't clear. The protective effects might be through the noradrenergic and acetylcholine systems. Those findings are still unclear, but it is interesting to note that nicotine can increase prolactin somewhat. There are a couple studies, I'd be happy to link to them in the caption, that shows that nicotine taken too much over too long periods of time can also increase prolactin, which again is the opposite side of dopamine. So today we've talked a